to get back to this, this is called an evaporative coil. It's called an evaporative coil because what you do with this coil is that you send liquid freon into this coil. You release it. There's a little metering. There's a capillary tube, or it's called an expansion valve, right? A lot of times it's not even an expansion valve. Sometimes it's just a very thin tube that allows liquid freon to flow into this coil. As the liquid freon flows into this coil, it evaporates. It evaporates at a very low temperature. Could be minus 20 or something like that. So this coil becomes very cold. So what you do is you put a fan behind this coil. So you suck air from the room and you blow it out through this coil. So you cool the air. In the process of cooling the air, because this coil gets so cold, not only does it cool the air, but it gets the air cold enough that it goes below what's called its dew point. It goes, and you know that the amount of moisture that air can hold is proportional to its temperature. So you got warm, humid air in the room. You run it over, you blow it over this cold, really cold coil. Some of that water condenses. And you've seen that there's a pan underneath here. And that pan has a little tube that comes out of it. And very frequently that'll go outside of your window and you'll see it dripping. Nowadays you don't see that drip so often anymore because they take advantage of that water. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how they do that in a minute. But you remember, it used to be that you'd see these air conditioners dripping all the time. That's your sweat condensing out of the air, and dripping out of the back of the unit. So that freon is cool. That freon you're releasing in there is changing from a liquid to a gas, and as it's evaporating, it's absorbing heat and cooling the air that you're blowing over it. That's coming from the room. As it happens, you also have the filter in front of there, that little filter that you have to keep changing because it gets dirty. So that in the process of recirculating this air from your room, it's also cleaning the air up. So this is familiar so far, right? If you imagine a window unit air conditioner, you put your hand in front of there and the air is blowing out cold because it's blowing over this coil. Okay, so now we have a gas now. We have Freon gas now. Freon gas doesn't do us any good. We can't reuse Freon gas. Keep doing this. And obviously you don't go out and buy Freon gas because it's expensive. So you take this gas and you send it into a machine, a pump called a compressor. That compressor takes the Freon gas and compresses it into a smaller space. Some of the big ones in commercial air conditioning systems are right, just like cars. They got pistons in them. Yours has this little centrifugal, kind of almost fan-like device. They call them centrifugal compressors, right? So now you take that gas and you compress it, and now you have a hot gas. Why do you have a hot gas at this stage? Because when you compress a gas, right? Remember temperature, volume, and temperature, pressure, and volume are related. So when you compress a gas, it gets very hot, right? Just like when you expanded it, it got cold. When you evaporate, it got cold. So now you still don't have what you need, right? You got that compressor. You still don't have you have a hot gas. Now you have to. I'm going to extend this a little bit. Now you have to take that hot gas and you got to turn it into a liquid. And the way that you do that is you take the compressed gas, you send it into another coil called a condensing coil. And you put a fan back there and you blow air over that coil. And that takes the heat away from that hot gas and turns it back into a liquid. And now you reuse that. That's your refrigeration cycle inside a window air conditioning unit. Okay? And that goes on and on and on and on. That's why you feel heat coming out of the back, right? Because you're condensing that hot gas. And that's why you have cooling in the front, because you're evaporating that liquid that you recreated. Okay, now what happens if you turn that unit around in the window? You install it backwards. What do you think might happen? You're cooling the air outside. You heat your house. You ever hear of a heat pump? That's a heat pump. That's what a heat pump does. The only difference between that and a heat pump is you don't take it out and turn it around. It's got little valves and switches in it, so it changes the condensing coil to an evaporative coil and the evaporative coil to a condensing coil. That's what a heat pump does. That's it, right? So that's the basic air conditioning Freon cycle. That's how we make cold air. Now, this isn't very practical. This is nice for a window, right? But it doesn't seem all that practical for a giant building. Yes? The condensation? Well, what happens is that normally that condensation, I'm going to redraw it here. Normally you have the coil, right? You have the coil over here. The condensation builds up in it. There's a little drain on the bottom of it and a tube that comes out, a little copper tube or something like that. Goes outside the window, and it used to drip out, right? You don't see the drip anymore. The reason why you don't see the drip anymore is because now on the condensing coils, if they take all the coils, they drop one coil into the bottom of the one or two coils into the bottom of the pan, right? So what happens now is that the condensate, instead of building up, gets evaporated away by that coil in the back, so you don't get the drip. Not only that, but cooling with water makes it more efficient. So you raise the EER, energy efficiency rating, of the unit, plus you get rid of that pain in the butt drip, right? So it starts 2 units. That's why you don't see the drip anymore, because they went for higher efficiency units. So it was worth putting the extra money into making that coil drop down into that. Okay, so that's basically how these systems work. So, but in a big building, occasionally you might have a building where you have a floor like this, where they have what's called a split unit. Okay, where now I'll go back to a residential home. Let's talk about a residential home. Residential home has the next higher version of this. And what you might have in somebody's house, here's somebody's house. What you might have in the basement of somebody's house is a forced air heating system or cooling system, and it has ducts that go up into the house. And there's a furnace in here. There's a little burner in here and a heat exchanger, so it heats up the air. And here's the air coming back down from the first floor, returns to the unit, and then you have ductwork and so on and so forth. Well, there's a furnace in there with a little, like a heat exchanger. The fire goes on one side, and then there's a smokestack, goes out the smokestack, so you don't poison everybody in the house. And the air from the house goes on the other side. You got a fan. Well, what they'll do very frequently is they will put a Freon coil in here. And that Freon coil, in the summertime, the burner goes off. You're not heating. And you use that Freon coil, you blow air over that Freon coil to cool the air and to condense the air, right? So in order to, that's a bit bigger since you're doing the whole house, and the compressor is going to be noisy and large. So what they do is outside of the house, they put the compressor and the condensing coil outside of the house, and you've seen these outside. And if they get clogged up with leaves, that doesn't work because you can't take the heat away from the condenser. You got to clean that coil outside of the house. So it works exactly the same way, except it's a split unit. The evaporative coil is indoors, and the condensing coil and the compressor are outdoors. Now, okay, next step. Now you have a floor on an office. In an office, I'm looking from the top down. Okay, and you have a room that you call a mechanical room. A lot of times they'll call this an MER, mechanical equipment room. And what you do there is that you will put, maybe on the roof, you'll put a condenser and evaporator, and you'll put a very large coil and fan in here. And it's big enough that you have like large duct, maybe 8 or 10 square feet across, going across this whole office and then branching off to feed offices throughout the floor. Okay, you might have buildings where they have something like that, where they call that a DX unit, direct expansion unit. In other words, the Freon coil is doing the cooling. That should be a hint to you that there's other ways to do this than use a Freon coil if they gave it a special name like direct expansion, like the expansion being the evaporation of the Freon. Outside, it's a regular condensing coil. That's called, a lot of times when it's a big unit like this, they call that an air-cooled condenser. And you'll hear that come up, what kind of unit is that? Well, it's a DX unit with an air-cooled condenser. Right? It's got the air-cooled condenser outdoors. So now a lot of times you might have a building where you might have a mechanical room with 2 of these units, and one of them is cooling one side of the building, one side of the floor, and the other one's cooling the other side of the floor. But it's not very effective for very large buildings because then you got the same problem with the ductwork. So what happens next? What happens next is you need cooling on every floor of the building, but it's inefficient to waste all that space and to waste all that money on giant ductwork, make the cool air in one place, make giant ductwork. So instead of making Cold air, you make cold water in the basement. Okay, in the basement or on the roof or sometimes they're on the roof or something like that, or on the top floor or whatever. There's another mechanical equipment room. Okay, you're going to put this one down in the basement. And this unit in the basement, here's the building, there's multiple floors, right? And in this situation, you have a device called a chiller. And what it consists of a cylinder, and in that cylinder is a Freon coil. Okay, actually it looks something like this. There's a whole bunch of tubes in here. Go at both ends, and there's a header at the end. So the Freon goes into the tubes, comes out the other side, right? But you evaporate the Freon by releasing it into these tubes, having it come out the other side. But now on the outside of those tubes or that coil is water. You take water, you pump water in, pump water out. It chills the water to 45 degrees. You send that water up to devices, boxes on each one of the floors. You send water up to them. Each one of the floors, cold water, 45-degree water, right? Each one of those floors, and you put fans in there. And you put a coil, a water coil with cold water in it. You blow air across that cold water coil, and then you collect that water after it's gone through. It goes into that coil at 45 degrees, cools the air, comes out at 55 degrees. Now you got to recool that water. So you send it back down again, and there's a pump here, and it gets sent through the chiller again. So it recirculates all the time. But you're still using up the Freon, right? You need to recycle that Freon. So the Freon gas comes out the other end of this. You need a way to recycle it. Well, one of the ways you can recycle it is have that air-cooled condenser. So you can have a chiller with an air-cooled condenser. That's possible. That's a possibility. A lot of times, though, these units are so large that you would need an enormous surface area of coils to cool that Freon so you can reuse it. So instead of doing that, they take that Freon and they send it into another similar shell with tubes in it. That's called a condenser. This is called a water-cooled condenser. And you do exactly the same thing. You send the hot Freon. There's a compressor, compresses the gases. Very frequently, that's either a centrifugal device or a piston-driven device, usually electric, but it can be other kinds of sources of energy. And you take that, you compress it into a hot gas. The hot gas gets released into this condenser now, this water-cooled condenser. You run water over this. The water comes in at about 85 degrees. These are pretty much universal temperatures for these kinds of systems because this equipment is designed to work this way. And the water comes out at 95 degrees. And it takes the heat away from the Freon. So it turns it back into a liquid and you can reuse it again, back in your chiller. Okay, so a lot of times this piping that's supplying the chilled water can also be connected to a boiler that's producing hot water. And in the wintertime, you just valve over, stop using the chiller, valve over to the boiler and send hot water into the same devices, air handlers, blow air over that to make warm air in the winter as opposed to cold air in the winter. So warm air comes out of those. Sometimes you use the same piping. That's called sometimes a chilled hot system. Use the same piping for heating and cooling. I'm sorry? Well, you save piping. You save pipe. It's a simpler system. But if you want to spend a little bit more money, you can actually send separate piping up to those air handlers. So you have two coils in them. When you blow the air over them, you can have a cold chill water coil and you can have a hot water coil. And so they have a lot of flexibility to, when you get quite in between and one day you want heat, one day you want cooling, you have a little bit of flexibility, right? But that goes up to all those air handlers. But now you got a problem. Took 85-degree water, you raise it to 95 degrees, it's too hot to use again, right? These systems are very carefully balanced. You have to cool that water. Anybody got any ideas how we cool that water? Anybody ever hear of a cooling tower? Right? Have you seen cooling towers? You know what they look like? Cooling towers. I got a couple of pictures in the presentation. I'm going to explain how they work before we actually look at a picture. What happens now is that water is coming up here at, what did I say, 95 degrees. We need to get it to 85 degrees. There are boxes on the roof of many of these buildings or in the parking lot or wherever where you take that water, you send it up to this device, and this device has a spray header in it, a big pipe with a bunch of spray nozzles in it. And it takes that water and it sprays that water into this box. At the same time that you're spraying the water into this box, you're blowing air across it, right? Tons of air, right? Now, what does the air do to that water? It evaporates it, cools it, you get some sensible cooling, but your principal cooling is due to evaporation. Roughly 1% of that flow evaporates and then collects at the bottom in a sump. And that's enough to cool it 10 degrees. Now 85 degrees, it goes back down, and you reuse it to recool that water. That's what those cooling towers are. Inside the cooling tower, they also have a material, a corrugated material, like sometimes PVC, used to be wood, and so on and so forth. And it's in there because when you spray it on, there are kind of sheets on there. So when you blow the air through, you get like you get more surface area between the air and the water rather than big droplets or something like that. Right? So that gives you a mechanism for cooling the air. So here you go. You got that cooling tower. Anybody know what cooling towers are associated? What bad thing cooling towers are associated with? Legionella, right? Because why is it a problem in this particular device? Right? Well, because you're blowing air through it, so all sorts of crap gets filtered out of the air, including bugs, pathogens and mold spores and leaves and all kinds of other stuff. But there's something important about the cooling tower in particular. The water is between 85 and 90 degrees. On a really hot day, it goes up to 100, 105. What's a great range for proliferating Legionella, for growing Legionella? Anywhere between 90 and about 110 degrees. Great temperature to grow that particular bacteria. Loves that temperature. So not only do you have an environment that's dirty, has plenty of nutrients in it, that is constantly oxygenated, that has a slimy material, you grow all sorts of algae and crap inside these things, right? So it's got an environment that has like very protective, that where it can hide and stuff like that. And not only you have that, but you're blowing air across it. And they put these devices either on the top or the side where the air exits the cooling tower. They're called drift eliminators. And what does that mean? That means they're supposed to eliminate the droplets of water from getting blown out of the cooling tower, right? They're not 100% efficient. You stand next to one of these things, you get wet. You get some spray. You feel some spray from it. What's in that spray? Droplets of water, right? And what's in those droplets of water? Legionella. So if you start to get a cooling tower now, interestingly enough, Legionella is ubiquitous in nature. It's like in a lot of places. You find it in lakes, ponds, and so on and so forth. The problem is occasionally you find it in very high concentrations. Most people in an environment, like exposure to small amounts of Legionella, not a big problem. Your body deals, your immune system deals with it. It's when they really get into higher numbers, or when the kind of exposure is very, very tiny particles like mist, like from a humidifier, let's say, that can get very deep into your lungs so they can get established, right? But in cooling towers, usually it's not a big problem unless you start to grow a lot of them. But once you start to grow a lot of them, then you got to be concerned about that drift. And many of the outbreaks have occurred because these discharges from these cooling towers are right next to a fresh air intake to the building or windows to the building. It's not unheard of to find that happening. So it winds up getting pulled into the air conditioning system, and multiple people in the building get exposed. Where is this the biggest problem? What kind of places is the biggest problem? What kind of people are most susceptible to this? Hospitals, elderly people, people with immunocompromised systems, cancer patients who are taking medications or drug treatments that make them immunocompromised. That's where you hear about a lot of the outbreaks of nursing homes, hospital Columbia Presbyterian had 2 outbreaks from the same system. They, interestingly enough, one of those 2 outbreaks was associated with their domestic water system. Why would it be associated with the domestic water system? What temperature do you think we make cold, when you get cold water out of your faucet, what temperature do you think it is, roughly? It's even lower than 70. In the wintertime, might be as low as 40. Summertime is probably like 50, 55. It's cold. You feel, put your hand under it, it's cold. If you don't feel the temperature in the water, it's room temperature. If you don't, it doesn't feel warm or cold for you, probably room temperature. But if it's colder than that, it feels cold. So it's usually anywhere from 40 to about 55, depending on the season, right? So now, cold water doesn't seem like a great place for this to grow. What temperature do you think the hot water is coming out of your spigot, the hottest it gets? Well, the New York City Department of Health regulates that, right? They recommend that you keep it between 120 and 140. Not a great growth range for Legionella. That's one of the reasons they tell you to keep it at 120. Why do they keep it at 140, not above 140? Well, yeah, you don't have time to put your hand under there, 140 degrees. You won't have time to pull your hand away. You'll get burned, just testing the water, right? Why do you think a hospital like Columbia Presbyterian, a lot of cancer patients, a lot of elderly, might keep their domestic hot water at 110 degrees? They can't move. Those old people, they don't sense it. They don't move fast enough, right? Those old people, not me. Those old people. Yeah. Right. So they keep their domestic water 110 degrees. What grows on 112 to 10 degrees? Legionella. So it's not unusual for them to have outbreaks. In fact, they wound up putting a special chlorinating system into their domestic water system so they could keep the temperature down because they still had the issue. The other thing is that they may have a wing that maybe it's unoccupied for a while. So you have water that's stagnant, that's staying at room temperature long periods of time, builds up in slime, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the issues, but that's cooling towers. The cooling towers can impact indoor air. They're part of the air conditioning system. They can impact indoor air. What other part of this system you think can have an impact on indoor air? What about mold? Where is mold likely to grow in a system like this? Where the condensation takes place, right? Because you're building up water, you have standing water. Any place it's wet, you have the potential for mold. Well, what can happen here? You know that coil we were just talking about? Right? We're blowing air, whether it's chilled water or freon, we're blowing air across it and it's got fins on it, right? Well, they're designed, the fan is matched. So when you blow air across it, it doesn't blow the water off the coils down into the ductwork, right? It doesn't blow air fast enough to remove the water and blow it down into the ductwork. It lets it drip down and collect in the condensate pan. Well, let's say that coil in a large building is 10 feet tall and 20 feet wide. That's not unusual, right? With all these coils and so on and so forth. Let's say that coil gets dirty, right? And air can't get through half of it. What happens to the velocity in the other half? Right? The air wants to push the same amount of air through, right? The same Q. If you cut the area in half, what happens to the velocity of the air going through the coil? It doubles, right? So now it's moving through there fast enough to blow the moisture off the coil into the ductwork. And what do they have a lot of times inside this ductwork besides metal? A lot of times they insulate the inside of the ductwork. If you were to go into this ceiling, because they want to get the cold air or the hot air into the room, they don't want to heat or cool the ceiling space. There's a space above here, by the way. They don't want to cool the ceiling space or heat the ceiling space. The insulation, the ductwork is not just plain metal, it's insulated, right? If the ceiling wasn't here, they might not bother to insulate it because it's part of the room, right? But most of the time they insulate it. Above here, it's definitely going to be insulated. A lot of times they'll insulate the outside of the ductwork, right? Which is fine. Doesn't matter as far as heat conduction is concerned. Don't matter if you insulate the outside or the inside, right? But a lot of times they will insulate the air handler device, and they'll insulate maybe the first 20 or 30 feet of the ductwork on the inside instead of on the outside. Anybody, since it's not a thermal consideration, what other consideration might they have for insulating the inside rather than the outside? If you were going to set up a music studio, what would you do to the walls? Put soft stuff on the walls. Put carpeting on the walls. You've seen them put egg crates on the, like those cardboard egg crates, right? Because the soft stuff absorbs the sound better. They do it for sound attenuation, noise, right? And a lot of times, if they're really sensitive, like a radio studio and so on and so forth, they'll insulate all the ductwork on the inside to reduce the sound of noise going through the ductwork, the air going through. Now you don't hear it now because there's so much other noises that we have here. right? But believe me, if we're dead silent here, you could hear the air moving through the ductwork coming out the diffuser. Right? So a matter of background noise that's diminishing it. Okay, so that's how we have a system where we're recirculating air all the time. We have a few issues where we're going to have problems, mostly associated with moisture. We have filters in them that are designed to take out some of these air handlers also have filters in them. So I've left out one important component which is important in indoor air quality. In fact, it's responsible for at least 50% of the indoor air quality complaints. It's the single most common factor that the EPA has found in studies on indoor air quality complaints. What do you think that is? What have I not done here? What's that? Bingo, fresh air from outside. You need exchange with outside air. If you don't have exchange from outside air, these air handlers are recirculating the same air all the time. We have air coming out of some of these diffusers here. Where's the air go after it comes into the room? Got to go somewhere, because otherwise, if there's air in here already, and you're trying to put more air in here, but it's got nowhere to go, then you can't get air in here. You want to know something? In this room, they disguise the returns in this building. The returns are other diffusers. In most buildings, you will see kind of a grill-like structure. One of these will be popped out, and they'll be kind of like a grill, in the ceiling. That's your return, right? And the way the return works is that the space in the ceiling is wide open, goes all the way back to the mechanical room where the air handler is. So the air just moseys up to the ceiling, moseys back to the air handler, and gets recirculated again, right? What's that? Well, it's so slow. Remember, coming in here is coming through ducts, small ducts. Going back, it's got the whole ceiling space. So that air is moving very slowly because it's got so much space up there. So you really don't hear it up there, right? So that's called a return air funnel. The ceiling in here is a return air funnel. You don't see grills in the ceiling, because if you actually put a measurement device up there, you would see that on half of these, air's coming out. On the other half, air's going the other direction. How many of you were in the lab when we put those barometer up there? We actually measured it, and you could see that some of them the air's coming this way, the other ones the air's going that way. You guys recall that, right? So I'm not lying. So others of you, I'm not lying. Some of these are returns, and they did that because it's aesthetic. They all look the same, so it doesn't look like you got this weird kind of, like non-functional weird grill or something like that in the ceiling. Most buildings won't bother with that. They'll just go ahead and bite the bullet, put a grill in. Yeah. That could be the return. It's probably just a term, some sort of term, or just mounting metal that's emptying it into the ceiling. Sometimes you can tell, because in New York air, which is fairly sooty, what happens is that the air comes in here. I don't know what the filters are like in here. Air comes out through these diffusers, and it comes out sideways, right? It doesn't come straight down. It comes out kind of sideways, and the air, it kind of curls, right? And it comes back and hits the ceiling. And you may have noticed that, especially in places where they have the fresh air intakes, the air conditioning system on the first floor, like banks, for instance. Banks almost always have their own air conditioning systems. It's a security thing, right? Ductwork people can sneak in through ductwork. So they have their own air conditioning system. And usually banks are where? They're on the corner, on the first floor, next to the bus stop, right? And their fresh air intakes are over the door or something like that, right? And you get a lot of sooty air in there. And what you'll see is when you look up at the ceiling, you look at those diffusers, you'll see an odd pattern of black sooty marks around the diffusers. And that's from that air turning and those soot particles, which are oily, impacting the ceiling and sticking to it. So and they'll all have their unique own patterns based on what kind of diffusers that they are. Jack was just mentioning today, we were working on this certificate session that Rutgers provides for some companies. And he mentioned today that they've done analyses of that soot that you get in the air, and a significant portion of it, which surprisingly is not actually car exhaust anymore, and diesel exhaust anymore, because cars run cleaner now. But a larger portion of it now is literally rubber particles from worn tires, from all the traffic and so on and so forth. So what used to be primarily soot now is primarily rubber particles now from that exhaust. So if you ever see snow when it turns black, what's happening is that it's accumulating all that soot from the air as it falls, and also as it just sits there, it's accumulating the soot that's falling out, the soot, the particulates falling out of the air, and then it's melting, so it's compacting. So instead of having like, big surface area, big mountain of snow with a little bit of soot on it, it looks a little dirty. By the time it gets down to like something the size of this desk, it looks like something that crawled out of the sewer, right? It really, really gets pretty nasty. That's just because it's concentrated, at that point. So anyway, so that's how these systems work. That's principally how these systems work. And it's important to understand these because the first thing you're going to do when you do an indoor air quality investigation is that you're going to try and figure out how does this system work and where might there be issues. So I've described this system to you. Now, you go to a new building and you've never seen this building before. What's the best first step to understand how this air conditioning system works? I mean, you're going to go into the building, you're not going to go wander around by yourself, right? You're going to go to the building engineer or the building manager's office, right? And what's he going to have in his office that'll help you out right off the bat? Plans. He'll have plans, drawings that describe all of the equipment, describe where the ductwork goes, so where the air handlers are. So you can look at those plans and you can start to understand how the system operates, how it works. Most of the time, in the industrial ventilation and the indoor air quality workbook, he spends a lot of time on evaluating systems in terms of, are they delivering the right amount of air? Are they doing this? Are they doing that? Most of these things have been designed by professional engineers and architects and so on and so forth. You really functionally don't really get involved very much in checking their design. Most of the time, you're mostly involved in checking whether things are working correctly, whether or not somebody has done something to subvert their design. Close dampers, disconnect dampers. Dampers are almost like Venetian blinds, open and close to let air go through and not go through. Do something to interfere with fresh air intakes or disable fresh air intakes in some situations. Okay, so now why would you not want fresh air? Why do you limit the amount of fresh air that's coming into a building? Well, let's say it's August, and we're all here, very happy to be at school because it's air conditioned. It's when I was a kid, a very young kid, we didn't have air conditioning. People didn't have air conditioning. I mean, if you were rich, you had air. You might have a air conditioner in your parents' bedroom. That's it. You didn't have it. You didn't have your own air conditioner as a kid. And I used to love to go to the library. Did I like going to the library to read? No. Why did I go to the library in the summertime? It and the movie theater were the only places that were air conditioned I could go to, and I didn't always have a quarter to get into the movie, right? So, well, back in those days, they had a lot of. It isn't like today where they have these immense blockbusters every week, and you pay $14 to get into a movie, and you go to these multiplexes without every. When I was a kid, every neighborhood had 2 or 3 small movie theaters. And during the daytime, at night, they might charge $1 or 2. During the daytime, they had matinees where they'd have like 2 movies, B movies or something like that, or science fiction movies. And in between, they'd have like some sort of contest and give away glasses or whatever. And you would go to the movie. It cost like a quarter or something like that to get into the movie. Saturday matinees. They'd have all these like old, Abbott and Costello films. And back then, some of them were actually new films. But they'd have a lot of B movies that you see sometimes. You by accident you might flip past on TV while you're trying to get to Game of Thrones or something like that, right? So they would have movies like that. So you go to the movie and you spend the whole day there for a quarter, and you buy like Milk Duds or something like that for 25 cents. It wasn't like now. So it wasn't like now you buy a soda. I can't tell you the last time I went to there. I can't tell you what they handed me when I asked for a small. It was phenomenal. I mean, I've seen some ridiculous stuff, but see now there's something that remember Bloomberg was anxious to restrict access to large volumes of those big Slurpee things, 16-ounce or 22-ounce sodas and so on and so forth. I think he had the wrong target. Instead of like telling them they couldn't sell those, I would have said a more practical approach that most people have found more acceptable would have been to say that if you're going to sell a 22-ounce soda, you also have to offer an 8-ounce version that's proportionally priced. right? Doesn't sound reasonable? Like, in other words, if you're going to sell a 22-ounce Slurpee, you have to have a version of it that's only 8 ounces, and instead of $2, the 8 ounce one is $1 or 75 cents. In other words, not priced so that this one's $2 and this one's $1.75, like they do in the movies, right? The 8 ounce one's $1.70, but proportionally priced. Now that people would have accepted that because people go insane to go to the movies. They spend, they get a small soda and it's like a quart, right? And then like you ask, well, what about the child size? And it's 5 cents cheaper, so and that's how they drive. Yeah, that's how they justify charge. Right. So now, and it would be effective. It would be almost equally effective because people very often would choose to buy the smaller version rather than the larger version if there was a rational price difference between the two of them. And if they made it available, you got to beg for a smaller one. They do it. A lot of them will have children's versions of these things, obviously, but try and convince them to sell it to you. You really have to force them to sell it to you. No, I don't want that. I want that one over there. So I mean, I think that would have gotten through the city council because then they can't argue that, oh, like who's he to restrict our freedom to buy these things? It's ridiculous. He's a maniac, and it's just another one of his crazy schemes, like no smoking, right? You guys remember that whole thing with no smoking? Every bar in the city said they were going to go out of business. Every restaurant was against it, right? What happened now? The whole rest of the country is falling in line. Right? So you got a few really good initiatives in terms of public health. He got a little off the deep end. But anyway, I'm going off the deep end on this anyway because it's not related to this stuff. Okay, so anyway, get the air conditioning. You go to the library to get to the air conditioning. So not everybody had air conditioning back in those days. I don't know why I brought that up. I forgot now. I went so deep into it, I forgot why I brought that up. I remember it was relative to this, but it's not anymore. Okay, so refrigerants, many different kinds of refrigerants. The refrigerants have been changing over recent years. From our perspective, we don't really care because whatever they're using is designed for that particular system to deliver air at the right temperature, deliver water at the right temperature, chill water at the right temperature. From our perspective, it's not too important. But the reason why there's so many alternative refrigerants now is because we know that these chlorofluorocarbons damage the ozone layer. And these alternatives basically are chemicals that will also, you compress them, they turn into a liquid. You let them expand, they evaporate and cool. Ammonia refrigeration plants used to be very common industrially. They still are to some degree, where they actually use ammonia instead of Freon. Why would you not want to use ammonia in a commercial office building, right? If you get a leak of Freon, you know what Freon smells like when it leaks? You don't smell it. It doesn't smell, right? Most Freons don't smell. There are a couple that have some odor, right? You know how harmful it is, Freon, when it leaks? I think the threshold limit value for Freon is like 1,000 or 10,000. Yeah, it's ridiculously inert unless you burn it because chlorofluorocarbon. If you burn it with an open flame, then you get into a little bit of trouble there and stuff like that because you release chlorine or hydrochloric acid, other kind of nasty gases and stuff like that. But normally, in normal use, it's not that. There is presumably, you get very high concentrations. Some sensitive people get arrhythmias from it, but I haven't heard of a fatality from Freon. That's not asphyxiation in a long time. Right? There are systems with halon. These computer rooms, some computer rooms, in order to avoid using water sprinklers, they will have halon, form of Freon, that they will release in the room to remove all the oxygen to asphyxiate the fire. And workers in that room have to be trained to evacuate when the alarms go off before this system goes off, or the fire and they will be asphyxiated will be extinguished at the same time. Right? And they're not as popular as they used to be because of the hazards, and also because the halon turned out to be another problem with the ozone layer. Okay, so a couple of ways we deal with water, we transfer heat is we take advantage of this evaporation and boiling. Boiling is a good way to move heat around because when you change water from 200 degrees to 201 degrees, a pound of water, you're adding 1 BTU of heat. If you take that water, send it to another spot, and it goes in at 201, comes out, that pound of water comes out at 200 degrees, you're releasing 1 BTU, right? But when you boil water, the transition from water at 212 to steam at 212 takes how many BTUs? Anybody remember a pound of water? I don't remember. 1200 or 593 or I don't remember. I get my units mixed up, 7th grade, but it's a lot, right? So when you send that steam somewhere, when the steam condenses, it releases an enormous amount of heat. It's very efficient to move heat using steam. Okay? And it's also efficient to move heat cooling using refrigeration. So here's our refrigeration cycle. We talked about this. The compressor, here's an expansion valve in your window unit. See this expansion valve? It's electronically controlled. If you're calling for cooling, it opens up, lets a little freon go through it. If you're not calling for freon, it closes. So you don't release the freon into the coil, it doesn't get cold, right? That would be expensive to put into your Costco $75, 5,000 BTU unit, because they make these in China. They give these machines away now, right? I mean, an air conditioning unit. When I was a kid, an air conditioning system was a problem. An air conditioning unit when I was a kid, those dollars probably cost twice what today's does in today's dollars. So what does that tell you? That probably tells you that it costs probably 10 or 20 times what it does today on air conditioning, right? A window unit air conditioning, right? Because literally it might cost $400 in 1965 or something like that, and now you get the same unit for 150 at Costco or something like that, or PC Richard or something. So they've come down in cost, but in order to come down in cost, they made some compromises on the design. Instead of an expansion valve, it's got a little capillary tube. The freon tube comes along, and just before it gets to the coil, it reduces into a tiny little tube, right? That only lets a tiny bit of freon go through. So what happens is freon's always going through there into the coil, and what happens is the compressor shuts off and stops creating more liquid freon that'll expand. So it's really the compressor is the boss now rather than that meter. It's always metered in there at a slow rate until you stop cooling it. And your refrigerator also uses a capillary coil also. Same deal. This is the way your refrigerator works also. Coils on the back, the condensing coils on the back, the evaporative coils are sometimes the trays themselves. Sometimes are actually coils, fans going through them, or it's in a coil on the back of the refrigerator that's covered with metal, but it's got a fan behind it blowing the cold air over it. So, and it works basically the same way. Okay, so the DX unit, there's a split unit we're talking about, heat pump. Okay, large air conditioning system, condenser and evaporator. There's a cooling tower. Okay, now this is what an air handler really looks like. This in a typical building is what an air handler might actually look like. Okay, and what you see there is on one end you see a fan, and that fan is blowing. This is like the world's best air handler, right? Because a lot of these air handlers will have that fan. See the fan over there? They'll have that fan. That fan will have right behind it's blowing air through this thing in this direction. That fan will then go through a filter bank. See that filter bank there? It's kind of like at an angle, straight up and straight across. That's a filter bank. Have like a thin filter bank where you have like these funny blue filters that are about an inch thick. You hold them up, you can almost see through them. You've seen these air conditioning filters, right? Might have a bank of those, so the air gets pushed through them, and then goes to. Let's skip this area. It goes over to a coil, like these things over here. This is actually 2 coils butted together. This might be a heating coil. That might be a cooling coil, right next to each other. So it gets blown over that, and then there's another fan maybe that helps it along, and then that little box there might be dampers or straightening vanes or something to get it to go straight, and so on and so forth. And then it goes up and then gets distributed with ductwork throughout the floor. Now, what you're not seeing here is the fresh air intake, where you connect the exchange air from outside. And you need that air from outside because what eventually happens to this stuff, right? What eventually happens? All the odors, body odors, odors from magic markers, perfumes, so that all that builds up in the air. So if you don't dilute that, then you wind up having that accumulate to the point where people feel it feels uncomfortable. You smell odors, Yeah, it may be there. You may sense it. Eyes may burn. There might be other effects that you sense. A lot of them are now chillers, absorption chillers is another mechanism, but it produces same deal. Produces cold water. One of these days, if we ever get Chime, I'll tell you how an absorption cycle unit works.